You can steal a car, but what happens when they accuse you of stealing your own life? The handcuffs clicked shut so sharply that conversations across the street died in an instant. Morning traffic rolled past the courthouse plaza in slow waves, but every eye near the curb turned toward the same scene. A black man in a charcoal overcoat stood beside a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, one wrist secured, the other held behind his back by Officer Daniel Mercer, whose jaw was tight with the certainty of someone who believed he was already right. "I asked you 3 times, Mercer said loudly, making sure the crowd could hear. "Step away from the vehicle and identify yourself." The man did not raise his voice. He did not struggle. He simply looked down at the polished hood of the sedan, then toward the marble steps of the courthouse towering across the street. "I told you," he said calmly. "The registration is in the glove box. The keys are in my hand. And court begins in 18 minutes. Mercer gave a short laugh that carried more arrogance than humor. "Court begins when I say you're free to go." A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably. Some lifted phones. Others looked away, pretending not to notice. The city knew this kind of silence too well. The man's name was Elijah Carter, though no one there knew it yet. His silver watch caught the pale Virginia sunlight as he checked the time again, not with panic, but with discipline. The kind learned over decades of arriving early, speaking carefully, and carrying more weight than most people could see. Mercer reached for the car door and yanked it open. Inside sat a leather briefcase, neatly placed on the passenger seat, a folded robe bag in the back, and a stack of case files bound with gold clips. None of it slowed him down. "Fancy props," Mercer muttered. "Trying to look important doesn't make this yours." Elijah's eyes moved to the files, then back to the officer. "You should open the top folder. You don't give instructions here." Across the plaza, a pair of attorneys stopped mid-conversation. A parking attendant stared at the reserve tag mounted near the windshield. It bore a state seal most people would have recognized instantly. Mercer never looked at it. His radio crackled against his shoulder. Dispatch sounded strained. "Unit 12, be advised we are attempting to locate Judge Carter. ETA overdue. Repeat, locate Judge Carter immediately." Mercer pressed the button without taking his eyes off Elijah. "Busy right now." He released the mic. "Different Carter." Elijah said nothing. The wind moved through the flags above the courthouse, snapping against the poles. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the quarter hour. 17 minutes now. Mercer guided him toward the curb with a firm hand and the confidence of a man performing for an audience. "You people always think rules don't apply if you wear the right coat and drive the right car." The words landed heavier than the cuffs. A woman in business attire inhaled sharply. An older veteran standing near a newsstand lowered his head. Elijah remained still, shoulders straight, gaze level. "Officer," he said quietly, "the law becomes fragile when it mistakes appearance for evidence." Mercer smirked. "Save the speech." Another burst of static came through the radio, louder this time. "All units, Chief Hale is en route. Locate Chief Justice Carter now." The plaza froze in a silence so sudden it felt physical. Mercer blinked once, then looked at the man in cuffs for the first time as if seeing him clearly required permission. Elijah Carter checked his watch again. 16 minutes. Officer Daniel Mercer felt the eyes of the plaza change before he understood why. Just seconds earlier, the crowd had watched him with the quiet curiosity reserved for ordinary street drama. Now they stared with something else entirely. Suspicion, doubt, even pity. The radio on his shoulder hissed again. "Unit 12, respond immediately. Chief Hale is arriving now. Subject is Chief Justice Elijah Carter." Mercer swallowed and pressed the button with a hand that no longer looked steady. "Copy." But his voice came out thinner than he intended. Elijah Carter remained beside the curb, one wrist still cuffed, coat collar moving slightly in the cold breeze. He did not look angry. That unsettled Mercer more than shouting ever could have. Men who screamed could be dismissed. Men who stayed calm forced others to hear themselves. A black SUV turned the corner fast, followed by another sedan with state plates. Both stopped at the foot of the courthouse steps. Doors opened almost at once. Chief Robert Hale stepped out first, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, moving with the urgency of a man who already knew the answer and feared it anyway. 2 court security officers followed close behind. The plaza fell into a hush so complete that even traffic noise seemed distant. Hale crossed the sidewalk without acknowledging Mercer. He went straight to Elijah. "Your Honor," he said, voice low and heavy. "I am deeply sorry." Mercer felt the words like a door closing somewhere behind him. Hale looked down at the cuff and then at Mercer. "Remove it. Now." There was no anger in the command. Anger would have been easier. This was disappointment sharpened into steel. Mercer fumbled for the key, dropping it once before catching it against his palm. The metal opened with a soft click that sounded louder than the first one had. Elijah rubbed his wrist once, then smoothed the sleeve of his overcoat. No dramatic gesture. No performance. Just dignity restoring itself. One of the court officers stepped forward with the leather briefcase from the Mercedes. Another handed Elijah a folder that had slipped onto the seat during the stop. The top page carried the state seal in gold. Mercer recognized it instantly now, too late for recognition to matter. Phones remained raised around the plaza. Some people recorded openly. Others lowered them, embarrassed to have watched in silence. A young law clerk near the steps wiped at her eyes. The veteran by the newsstand stood straighter, jaw tight. Hale turned toward Mercer at last. "Badge." Mercer blinked. "Chief, I can explain." "Badge." The second time was quieter and far worse. Mercer unclipped it slowly. The symbol that had felt permanent only minutes ago suddenly looked small in his hand. Hale took it without ceremony and passed it to an aide. "Administrative leave effective immediately. Internal review begins today." Mercer glanced at the crowd, searching for sympathy and finding none. He looked to Elijah, perhaps hoping for mercy, perhaps hoping for acknowledgement. Elijah gave him neither. He simply checked his watch again. 14 minutes. "Can we still make first session?" he asked Hale. The chief nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." We held the docket. Elijah picked up the briefcase and started toward the courthouse steps. Then he paused. Without turning fully around, he spoke so calmly that everyone leaned in to hear. "Officer Mercer, authority is tested most when no one important appears to be watching." The words settled over the plaza like winter air. No one moved. Elijah continued up the steps between marble columns that had seen generations pass beneath them. Reporters inside the lobby rushed to prepare for the day's hearing, unaware that the most important lesson had already happened outside. Mercer remained at the curb, hands empty now, while the same crowd that had once watched him command the street watched him stand in silence. Inside courtroom 1, the air carried the weight of old wood, polished brass, and expectations no one could name aloud. Rows of attorneys sat straighter than usual. Clerks whispered over calendars and case files. Reporters near the back adjusted notepads and glanced toward the doors every few seconds. Word traveled fast in government buildings, and faster when shame was attached to it. Chief Justice Elijah Carter entered without ceremony, briefcase in one hand, robe folded over his arm. Yet the room rose before he reached the bench. Some stood from respect. Others stood because everyone else did. He acknowledged no one with more than a slight nod. His face remained composed, but those who knew him well could see the extra stillness in his movements, the kind a person carried after being publicly measured and found misjudged. Chief Robert Hale followed several steps behind and took a seat in the front row reserved for officials. He looked less like a police chief than a man waiting outside a principal's office. Elijah placed the briefcase on the bench, opened it, and reviewed the top folder. The hearing scheduled for that morning involved allegations of discriminatory traffic stops across 3 counties, complaints that had sat unresolved for years, statistical reports, dash camera gaps, testimony ignored, cases delayed until witnesses moved away or lost hope. The irony was so sharp it needed no announcement. He had nearly become fresh evidence before the session even began. "Be seated," Elijah said. His voice was calm, measured, and impossible to rush. The room obeyed instantly. He adjusted his glasses and looked over the docket. "Before we proceed, I have one administrative matter." Pens paused. Laptops stopped tapping. Even the ceiling seemed to listen. "This court is not marble, robes, or titles," he said. "It is trust. And trust can be damaged in a parking lot as quickly as in a courtroom." No one moved. A young prosecutor lowered his eyes. 2 deputies near the wall exchanged an uneasy glance. Elijah continued reading, not performing, which made every word land harder. When authority assumes guilt before evidence, it does not merely embarrass an individual. It weakens every lawful command that follows. In the gallery, A woman whose son had filed one of the discrimination complaints pressed a hand over her mouth. She had come expecting procedure. Instead, she was hearing something closer to truth. Chief Hale shifted in his seat. Elijah finally looked toward him, not with hostility, but with expectation. Chief Hale, has your department preserved all body camera footage, dispatch logs, and incident reports related to today's matter? Hale stood immediately. Yes, Your Honor. Effective this morning, I ordered all related records secured. Good, Elijah said. Expand that order to include the incident outside this courthouse at 8:44 a.m. A murmur rippled through the room before dying under the bailiff's stare. Hale nodded once. It will be done. Elijah opened the first case file. Then let us begin. For the next hour, witnesses spoke about being stopped for reasons that changed with every officer. Broken tail lights that were not broken. Registrations already valid. Questions asked not to gather facts, but to test belonging. Elijah listened the way surgeons cut, carefully and without wasted motion. He asked short questions that exposed long failures. By 10:15, even seasoned reporters understood this hearing would lead every evening broadcast in the state. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Officer Daniel Mercer sat alone on a stone bench with no badge on his chest and no crowd around him now. The phones were gone. The curiosity had moved inside. He replayed the morning again and again, searching for the moment he could call a misunderstanding. But memory would not cooperate. He remembered the keys in Elijah's hand, the reserve tag on the windshield, the briefcase, the calm warning. The facts had been present from the start. It was judgment that arrived first. Inside the courtroom, Elijah closed one witness file and looked across the room. The law cannot ask citizens for patience, he said softly, while refusing them fairness. Every person there felt the sentence differently. None escaped it. By late morning, the courthouse no longer felt like a building. It felt like a mirror. Every witness who stepped forward reflected a story the system had tried not to see, and every answer given under oath seemed to pull another thread loose from a fabric long praised as unshakable. Chief Justice Elijah Carter listened from the bench with the same steady posture he had carried on the sidewalk outside, but now the room understood what that calm truly meant. It was not softness. It was control. A transportation supervisor described how black drivers in one county were searched at nearly 3 times the rate of white drivers during routine stops. A school principal testified that her teenage son had been detained twice while walking home in his own neighborhood. A retired nurse spoke about being asked whether the sedan she drove belonged to her employer. Each statement entered the record with the clean sound of keys striking paper from the court reporter below. Facts, once spoken aloud, had a way of refusing to disappear. In the front row, Chief Robert Hale kept his hands folded tightly enough to whiten the knuckles. He had led the department for 6 years and had inherited problems older than his tenure, but inheritance did not erase responsibility. Every few minutes an aide leaned in to whisper updates. From outside, media vans had lined the block. Reporters wanted statements. Community leaders wanted meetings. City officials wanted distance. Hale accepted none of it yet. He only listened. Across town, Officer Daniel Mercer sat in a small administrative office with beige walls and a clock that seemed louder than necessary. His service belt rested on the desk in front of him beside a yellow legal pad no one had touched. Internal Affairs Lieutenant Sandra Keene entered carrying a tablet and a folder. She was known for speaking plainly, a quality respected only after it was needed. She took the chair across from him and placed the folder between them. "This is a formal interview," she said. "You are not under arrest. You are under review." Mercer nodded once, eyes fixed on the badge-shaped 10 line on his uniform shirt where metal had been that morning. "Walk me through why you initiated contact." He cleared his throat. The vehicle looked suspicious parked near the restricted curb. Keene did not blink. It was in a reserved judicial zone. Mercer shifted. "I did not notice the tag." The tag was mounted on the windshield. She tapped the folder. "Multiple witnesses say Mr. Carter identified himself and directed you to registration documents." Silence stretched long enough to become its own answer. Mercer finally spoke. "I thought he was lying." "Why?" The single word hit harder than accusation. Mercer looked toward the window, where only a brick wall could be seen. "Because people lie." Keene waited. He understood what she was asking and what she was not saying. "That is not enough," she said quietly. "Not for cuffs." Not for public humiliation. Not for dismissing evidence in plain sight. Back in courtroom 1, Elijah reviewed a chart projected onto monitors showing complaint patterns clustered around certain officers, certain neighborhoods, certain assumptions. He removed his glasses and set them down carefully. Bias rarely announces itself, he said. It hides inside habits, jokes, shortcuts, instincts praised as experience. Several heads lowered across the room. That is why discipline matters. That is why standards matter. That is why facts must come before feeling. In the gallery, the veteran from the newsstand had found a seat near the aisle. He nodded slowly, as if hearing language he had waited years to hear spoken by someone with power. Outside the courthouse windows, the winter sun had climbed higher, bright against the stone steps where the morning had unfolded. Inside, the hearing moved forward with relentless patience. In the small office across town, Mercer stared at the untouched legal pad and realized something no training manual had prepared him for. Losing a badge was not the sharpest consequence. Seeing yourself clearly was. By early afternoon, the hearing had moved beyond complaints and into something more dangerous for those who had ignored them. Patterns. Charts filled the courtroom monitors. Dates lined up beside badge numbers. Body camera outages clustered around the same names. Stops with no citations. Searches with no findings. Complaints closed with identical language copied from file to file. It no longer looked like coincidence. It looked organized. Chief Justice Elijah Carter studied each exhibit with the patience of a man who understood that truth often arrived quietly, one document at a time. The courtroom was packed now. Law students leaned against the back wall with notebooks open. Reporters refreshed headlines on glowing screens. Community members sat shoulder to shoulder beside people who had once defended the system without question. No one appeared comfortable. Elijah adjusted the microphone slightly. When misconduct repeats, he said, the issue is no longer a person. It is permission. The sentence moved through the room like cold air. Chief Robert Hale exhaled slowly in the front row. He knew the words would be quoted by sundown. He also knew they were deserved. The next witness was a former records technician from the department, a woman named Denise Warren who had retired 2 years earlier. Her hands trembled when she was sworn in, but her voice steadied as she spoke. She described missing footage requests redirected without explanation, citizen complaints marked incomplete despite attached evidence, and pressure to classify certain incidents as resolved before. Review. I told myself I was only filing papers, she said. But papers decide what gets remembered. Several jurists on the side bench exchanged glances. Elijah nodded once, not in approval, but in recognition. Across town, Officer Daniel Mercer remained in the administrative office under fluorescent lights that made every minute feel longer. Lieutenant Sandra Keene had spread several photographs across the desk. The reserved judicial parking tag, the registration listing Elijah Carter as owner, the timestamps from dispatch calls, still images taken from bystander videos. Facts arranged neatly had a cruel efficiency. Did you know who he was when you placed him in restraints? Keene asked. No, Mercer answered. Would it have mattered if he had not been a judge? Mercer looked down. The question stripped away rank, procedure, excuses. It asked about the first impulse, the one before paperwork and policy. He did not answer quickly enough. Keene closed the folder. That silence is part of the record now. Outside the office window, rain had begun to tap against the brick alley, thin and steady. Inside the courthouse, the hearing entered its final session. Elijah reviewed emergency reform proposals submitted by civic groups that morning, mandatory review boards, transparent stop data, retraining standards, penalties for evidence suppression. He read each page carefully. No cameras could capture the most important part of leadership, which was attention. The public is often told to trust institutions, he said at last. Trust is not granted by uniforms or buildings. It is earned through conduct repeated when no spotlight is present. In the gallery, the mother whose son had filed a complaint earlier wiped tears she had held back all day. Beside her, a businessman in an expensive suit stared ahead with the uneasy expression of someone reconsidering every story he had dismissed as exaggerated. Chief Hale rose when recognized. Your Honor, he said, effective immediately, I am requesting an independent audit of all stop-and-search records over the past 5 years. Full cooperation from my office. A murmur spread, this time carrying surprise instead of cynicism. Elijah regarded him for a long moment. A beginning, he said, not an ending. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Recess until tomorrow. People stood, but few rushed out. They lingered as if leaving too quickly might return them to an older version of the city. In the small office across town, Mercer heard the news alert on a television in the hallway. He did not need to see the screen to know whose voice was leading the state now. Some men lose power in a moment. Others discover they never understood it at all. The next morning, rain-washed streets reflected the courthouse lights like strips of silver, and by 7:30 a line had already formed outside the main entrance. Some came for justice, some for spectacle, and some because they had finally learned the difference between the two. News crews stood behind barriers speaking into cameras. Retired officers in plain coats kept their heads low. College students held coffee cups and whispered about constitutional law as if it had suddenly become personal. Inside chambers, Chief Justice Elijah Carter reviewed overnight reports stacked beside his desk. Complaints had tripled in less than 24 hours. Citizens who had stayed silent for years were now calling, emailing, mailing affidavits, uploading old videos, naming intersections, naming dates, naming officers. Truth often waited for permission. Yesterday had given it some. Elijah set aside a handwritten letter from a grandmother in Norfolk who described being stopped 3 times in 1 month while driving to church. He read every line before placing it neatly in a separate folder marked public record. A clerk entered softly. "Sir, the chief is here." "Send him in." Robert Hale looked older than he had the day before. Crisis could add years overnight. He carried 2 binders and none of the defensive posture officials often wore when summoned. "Your Honor," he said, taking the chair only after Elijah nodded. "We completed the preliminary review. 12 officers reassigned pending investigation. External auditors confirmed irregular closure codes on dozens of complaints." Elijah opened the first binder. Pages of charts, memos, signatures. Systems did not fail by accident this often. "And Officer Mercer?" Hale hesitated. "Suspended without pay pending full board review. He requested to submit a statement directly to the court." Elijah looked up. "To the court, or to me?" Hale understood the distinction immediately. "To you, sir." Elijah closed the binder. Then he still misunderstands where accountability belongs. In a municipal office across town, Daniel Mercer sat at a metal table wearing civilian clothes that seemed to erase him more than disguise him. Without the uniform, he looked less like authority and more like a man confronting unpaid debts. His attorney slid a paper across the table. "You can argue procedure. You can claim confusion." Mercer stared at the blank signature line. "And if that is not true?" The attorney leaned back. "Truth helps only when offered early." Mercer thought of the keys in Elijah Carter's hand, the state seal on the windshield, the calm voice warning him before the radio ever spoke. He had not lacked information. He had rejected it. Back in the courthouse, the second day of hearings began with no empty seats. Elijah entered to the sound of people rising again, but today there was something different in the room. Respect had widened into expectation. Witnesses described small humiliations that never made headlines. Being asked if a nice neighborhood address was really theirs, being followed in stores after showing a receipt, being told to relax when concern was reasonable. Elijah listened as carefully to these as he had to the major cases. Institutions were not damaged only by scandals. They were eroded by daily dismissals. Mid-morning, he called for silence and addressed the room. Many imagine injustice arrives with sirens and dramatic scenes. Often it enters quietly, in assumptions so common they go unchallenged. Pens moved quickly. Cameras leaned closer. The danger of bias is not merely what it does to the targeted. It also corrupts the judgment of the one who carries it. Across town, Mercer signed the statement at last. Not a defense. Not an excuse. A full admission that he had ignored evidence because he trusted instinct over facts. His hand shook afterward, though no one else was in the room. Inside courtroom 1, Elijah closed the morning docket and looked over the gallery. "This state does not need perfection from its servants," he said. "It requires honesty soon enough to prevent harm." Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight touched the courthouse steps where yesterday disgrace had stood in public view. Today, people climbed them carrying folders, testimonies, and hope. By the third day, the hearings had become more than legal proceedings. They had become a reckoning people scheduled their mornings around. Cafes near the courthouse opened earlier to handle the crowds. Taxi drivers debated policy at stoplights. Radio hosts who once mocked reform now invited civil rights attorneys onto their shows. Across the state, people who had never entered a courtroom before watched live streams on their phones during lunch breaks. Inside Courtroom 1, the benches filled before sunrise. Chief Justice Elijah Carter entered carrying the same leather briefcase, wearing the same measured expression, but the room now rose with something deeper than formality. It was trust returning in cautious steps. The first witness that morning was an officer still on active duty, Sergeant Maria Bennett. She had served 14 years and had requested whistleblower protection before agreeing to testify. Her uniform was crisp, but her eyes showed the fatigue of someone who had carried truth alone for too long. She described training sessions where phrases like high crime look and suspicious type were repeated without definitions, where instincts were praised more than evidence, where certain neighborhoods were treated as hunting grounds rather than communities. Good officers learn fast, she said. They learn policy. Bad officers learn faster. They learn what gets tolerated. The room stayed silent after she finished. Elijah thanked her with a nod that carried the respect institutions too rarely give courage. Chief Robert Hale sat in the front row again, shoulders squared, taking notes by hand. He had stopped assigning aides to summarize these moments. Some lessons had to be written personally. Mid-morning, Hale was called to testify about reforms already underway. He described mandatory documentation for every discretionary stop, independent review panels, public dashboards for complaint outcomes, and revised promotion standards tied to community conduct rather than arrest numbers. Why now? One attorney asked sharply. Why not 2 years ago? Hill did not evade. Because leadership delayed what conscience should have done sooner. Murmurs moved through the gallery. Honesty sounded strange in official buildings because it was heard so rarely. Across town, Daniel Mercer parked outside the courthouse in an old sedan borrowed from his brother. No reserve tag. No marked unit. No badge to open doors. He sat behind the wheel for nearly 10 minutes watching people stream up the steps. Some recognized him and looked away. Others recognized him and did not. Shame, he was learning, had many faces. He entered through the public security line carrying no authority except the written statement already submitted. Inside the courtroom lobby, he saw the marble wall where portraits of former justices hung in gold frames. For the first time, he noticed how many years had passed before a black face appeared among them. He took a seat in the back row alone. Elijah saw him when court resumed, but gave no sign. Cases were called. Witnesses spoke. Experts explained how unchecked bias distorted data, morale, budgets, and public safety itself. Near noon, Elijah requested quiet. We speak often of community trust as if it belongs only to citizens, he said. Institutions also depend on trust from within. Honest officers are betrayed when misconduct is protected. Several current officers in attendance lowered their heads. Mercer felt the sentence like a weight placed carefully on his chest. It named something he had never considered. His actions had not only harmed the man outside the courthouse. They had dishonored every colleague who had tried to serve correctly. During recess, Mercer remained seated while others filed out. Chief Hale approached and stood beside the bench without sitting. You came, Hale said. Mercer nodded. I needed to hear it without a radio in my ear. Hale studied him for a long moment. Then hear this. 2. Accountability is not humiliation. It is the price of being trusted again. When the afternoon session began, sunlight poured through the high windows, warming the old wood panels. Elijah Carter returned to the bench and looked over a room fuller than any docket required. Some systems change because they are forced, he said. The stronger ones change because they finally listen. In the back row, Daniel Mercer listened harder than he ever had in uniform. On the fourth morning, the courthouse steps were lined not with cameras first, but with citizens carrying folders, envelopes, and worn memories. Some had driven 3 hours. Some had taken buses before sunrise. Some had never before believed anyone inside those walls would listen. The line moved slowly through security, yet no one complained. Waiting felt different when hope was part of it. Inside Courtroom 1, the final phase of hearings was set to begin. Chief Justice Elijah Carter entered to a room already standing. He paused for only a second before taking his seat, as if acknowledging that respect was welcome but work remained larger. The docket for the day was not centered on past failures alone. It focused on remedies. Policy experts presented national models for bias review systems, independent discipline boards, public complaint transparency, and mandatory evidence preservation. Economists explained the financial cost of wrongful stops, lawsuits, overtime reviews, and broken community cooperation. A pastor from Richmond testified that distrust could not be measured only in dollars because fear changed how children saw uniforms long before adulthood. Elijah listened to each witness with the same careful attention he had given every resident and official. Justice, he knew, often failed not from lack of intelligence, but from selective listening. Chief Robert Hale took the stand again before noon. He announced a department-wide reset, revised field training, quarterly public audits, anonymous reporting channels for officers, and the retirement of language that encouraged vague suspicion over documented cause. This will be resisted, one attorney said. Then lead through the resistance, Elijah replied before Hale could answer. The room grew still. Across the back row, Daniel Mercer sat in the same seat as yesterday, notebook open now, writing more than he looked up. No cameras followed him anymore. Public attention had moved to systems, which was where it belonged. Yet privately, he felt every sentence spoken from the bench. He wrote down one phrase twice, facts before feeling. During a recess, he approached Sergeant Maria Bennett in the hallway and asked quietly, "Were there signs I ignored?" She studied him with the caution of someone who had earned the right to be skeptical. "Yes," she said, "mostly from yourself." Then she walked on. The answer followed him harder than anger would have. Afternoon sunlight spread across the courtroom windows in long gold bars as Elijah called for closing statements. Lawyers argued statutes and jurisdiction. Advocates argued urgency. Union representatives warned against overcorrection. Citizens warned against delay disguised as process. When all had finished, Elijah removed his glasses and folded his hands. The room leaned toward silence. "Every institution tells a story about itself," he began. "Some say they are fair because they intend to be. Some say they are strong because they have lasted. Neither is enough." No one moved. Fairness must be visible. Strength must be accountable. And trust must survive contact with ordinary mornings. Many in the room thought of the sidewalk outside days earlier without needing it named. Elijah continued, "This court orders the immediate implementation of independent oversight measures, preservation standards, public reporting requirements, and retraining protocols consistent with findings entered into record. Compliance reviews will begin in 90 days. Pens raced. Reporters hurried to the hallway. A woman in the third row began to cry softly into her hands. Hale bowed his head once, accepting the burden publicly placed on him. Mercer stared at the floor, then slowly nodded as if some private verdict had also been delivered. Elijah lifted the gavel but did not strike it yet. "Let this be remembered," he said, voice calm and clear. "The law did not lose dignity when it was questioned. It lost dignity whenever questioning was ignored." Then the gavel fell once. Clean. Final. Outside, the doors opened and news spread down the steps faster than wind. Citizens embraced strangers. Reporters shouted updates into microphones. Church bells from 2 blocks away began to ring the hour. In the back of the emptied courtroom, Daniel Mercer remained seated alone, understanding at last that consequences were not the end of a story. Sometimes they were the first honest page. 2 weeks later, the courthouse plaza looked almost ordinary again. Commuters hurried with paper cups in hand. Delivery trucks double-parked for a minute too long. Pigeons claimed the fountain as if no history had ever happened there. Yet anyone who had stood on those steps the morning everything changed could feel the difference immediately. New signs marked public accountability offices near the entrance. Complaint forms were available in clear view instead of hidden behind counters. Officers assigned to courthouse detail greeted visitors with measured professionalism that looked less like performance and more like caution learned the hard way. Inside chambers, Chief Justice Elijah Carter reviewed the first compliance reports delivered ahead of schedule. Agencies often moved slowly until embarrassment accelerated them. Stop data was being published. Training contracts were rewritten. Supervisors once comfortable with silence were suddenly documenting everything. Elijah knew reform born from scandal could fade if not guarded, but he also knew momentum mattered. He signed orders creating quarterly review sessions open to the public, then stood by the window overlooking the same curb where handcuffs had clicked days earlier. Some mornings changed a person. Some mornings changed a city. Chief Robert Hale entered carrying a thin folder instead of the heavy binders from before. He seemed lighter, though not relaxed. Leadership under scrutiny was exercise no one enjoyed. First wave of implementation is underway, he said. Resistance exists, but less than expected. Elijah glanced at him. People often resist change less than they resist pretending change is unnecessary. Hale almost smiled. There is one more matter. He placed the folder on the desk. Daniel Mercer's final disciplinary decision. Permanent separation from service eligibility, with an option to apply after years of documented community rehabilitation and retraining. Elijah read the page, then closed it. Fair, he said. Consequences should close doors only long enough to teach the cost of opening them carelessly. Across town, Mercer was stacking canned goods at a neighborhood food pantry run out of a former church hall. No cameras, no reporters, no uniforms. He had volunteered every weekday since the ruling. Some residents recognized him and refused conversation. Others recognized him and said nothing at all. Silence from strangers could be harsher than insults. Yet he kept working, carrying boxes, sweeping floors, learning names he once might have overlooked. An elderly woman asked him to help load groceries into her trunk. He did. She thanked him without knowing who he used to be. For reasons he could not explain, that thank you stayed with him all day. Back at the courthouse, Elijah walked out at noon without escort, carrying his own briefcase as always. Staff offered to bring the car around. He declined. He preferred the short walk to the curb. Sunlight warmed the stone steps. Citizens passed him, some noticing, some not. Power, he believed, should survive anonymity. Near the fountain stood the veteran from the newsstand, hat in hand. Your Honor, the man said, voice rough with age. I watched what happened that morning. I also watched what happened after. Thank you for finishing the second part. Elijah regarded him gently. The second part is always the harder one. He reached his car, unlocked it, and paused before getting in. Across the street, a young black father knelt to straighten his son's tie before they entered the courthouse for a school field trip. The boy looked up at the columns with wide eyes, not fearfully but curiously. Elijah watched for a moment, then smiled to himself. Buildings mattered less than what children imagined inside them. As he started the engine, church bells rang the hour again, clear over traffic and voices. The city moved on, as cities do, but not unchanged. Somewhere behind desks, officials worked more carefully. Somewhere in homes, citizens stood a little straighter. Somewhere in one former officer, judgment had finally met humility. And on a quiet curb beneath marble walls, the law had learned that morning how easily it can be diminished by prejudice, and how powerfully it can be restored by truth.